Hi, my name is Dana Connors. I'm the president of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, and I, along with my special guest, Governor McKernan, who served our state from 1987 to 1995, and John Baldacci, who also served our state as governor from 2003 to 2011. Together, we're going to be tackling budgets during those very tough times. These two are the perfect people to share that particular stage because they are the ones who lived with it firsthand. They're the ones who had to deal with those tough choices when things go bad. Now let me be quick to add that there is no easy time in preparing a budget. The governors always spend a great deal of time putting forward, with the money that they have available to them, the priorities in spending that will move the state and help people's lives. Then they pass it to a legislature who looks at it, reviews it, makes modifications, but ultimately has to approve it because the Constitution requires that it must be balanced at the end of the day. The choices aren't easy because some want to do more, because there's always the challenge where the needs outweigh the revenue. So what are those choices that need to be made before they're finally approved? That's why it takes a lot of time. That's why there's a lot of compromises that must be made and commitments that need to be understood. Finally, the legislature and the governor agreed to a budget. Now, admittedly, it isn't easy. It's very important, but that's what's normal. But the two guests today that we have faced extraordinary challenges brought on by national circumstances, had nothing to do with what we were doing here in the state. Yes, there were some issues, but as you're going to see in the moment, so much of this extraordinary effort that went into making the decisions, the tough decisions, because of the tough times, had so much to do with what was happening at the national level. So first, let me begin by welcoming the both of you. It's a pleasure to be back with both of you on this occasion. You have a lot to talk about, a lot that needs to be shared, and I'm pleased that I have the opportunity to do it with both of you. Let's begin by kind of setting the stage, if you don't mind. I mentioned that the challenges that you face were brought on by national circumstances. They were due to influences that were outside of your control. Governor McKernan, the year was really 1991. You'd been elected to your second term. It was the Great Recession before the even greater recession took place in 2008. We saw that the nation had in fact dipped into a serious recession. We saw where the stock market had spiraled, the housing market had fallen, and businesses were really grappling with their ability to sustain the time we were in. But you also, as a result of all of that, and I find this remarkable, that with a $3 billion budget, you were faced with a gap of a third of that you had to deal with. Governor Baldacci, the year was 2002. It was November, in fact. You had just been elected. The state still continued a recession brought on by the attacks on our nation in 2001, September of 2001. But that wasn't the end of it. It continued to be a challenge. In 2008, we experienced the Great Recession that we all experienced. The budget challenges seemed to haunt you throughout your entire administration. But from the very get-go, you said, I'm going to face these challenges without raising taxes. So here we are. There's no question that the challenges you've both faced were not the normal. They were enormous. What else beyond what I said that brought emphasis to the fact that the economy was what it was and put you into this dire situation that we're about to explore in a couple minutes? What else can you share about that time that would be relevant to the challenge? Governor McKernan?
Well, Dana, as you recall, since you were my Commissioner of Transportation in 1991, you understand that that year was clearly not a very good year for either state economies or state budgets, from Pennsylvania all the way through New England to Maine. The northeastern region of the country literally lost 9% of its jobs between 1989 and 1991 during that recession. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it was so deep that we didn't recover that level of jobs that we had in 1989 until the mid-1990s. And that caused significant problems for all of the states, including Maine, which is why we initially looked at our 92-93 budget and found that we had almost as much as $1 billion of a gap between revenues and proposed expenditures if we didn't make some changes. Now, even worse, actually, was when the 1990 elections took place and new legislators were elected and came to Augusta for the 1991 session. We faced a $150 million revenue shortfall for the remaining 6 months of the year. And since the remaining 6 months was only an $800 million budget, that required us to find ways to save $150 million out of that 800, which is almost 20% that we had to cut between January and the end of the fiscal year in June, which was a very difficult chore, and we had to all work together to get it done.
20% you had to cut out of 6 months, and for the following 2 year, a third of your budget, $1 billion out of a $3 billion budget.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Governor Baldacci, it certainly can be said that you had many of those challenges, except yours probably started off in the very beginning. I can remember being at your inauguration as part of the crowd there cheering you on. You stood before the many people, and in that moment acknowledged that the parent company of Great Northern had declared bankruptcy and Great Northern was about to close down.
I was in my tuxedo when they gave me the announcement.
Yeah. Well, welcome to being governor.
Yeah, this is it. We were at a very low point, but it's best to start in a low point, then you have nowhere else to go but up.
Yeah, and I mentioned Great Northern as an example, but were there other things at that time in the economy that added to the challenge of what you knew that you faced at that time, but it continued to be apparent to the rest of the 8 years?
Maine had the highest tax burden in the country, state and local tax burden in the country. And during a campaign, we took an issue with not raising taxes. And I remember what happened to George Bush Sr. when he did that famous speech. So I was very much wired to making sure it never happened. It didn't happen. Other than cigarette taxes, which I would increase any time of the day. You know, it was one that I felt this tax burden was something, so you had to protect the economy. And we protected the economy by balancing the budget without raising taxes. Had a very difficult time. It didn't go over very well with some of my Democratic colleagues, but it was the right thing to do to get us in a more middle row in terms of the states with tax burdens.
So let me ask for both of you. I'll start again with you, Governor McKernan. It was as you were reelected to your second term, you faced, as you just mentioned a moment ago, not only a supplemental challenge, but a biennial major challenge, similar to what Governor Mills is actually facing today. And you became aware of this dramatic need to address almost immediately, if not immediately. What was the first thing you did? How did you approach that from day one, and what remedies did you set in place, knowing that it wasn't a quick fix and it wasn't an immediate type of thing? What did you put in place that created a pathway forward for you?
Well, the first thing that I did when my Commissioner of Finance and State Budget Director came in and told me that they thought that the shortfall was going to be significantly larger than they thought, I said, I'm pleased that I have a very good finance commissioner and a very good state budget director, because they actually had a plan on how we should be addressing this $150 million shortfall. we'd been actually tracking revenue since the beginning of the fiscal year through the summer and into September. And during that time period, we saw a softening. We saw revenues not quite hitting a target, but we knew we also had some additional revenue that was going to be coming in and some tax payments that were due. So we felt we could get through this. And then when we saw the October numbers at the beginning of November, we realized we had a serious problem. In fact, you remember, John, that Alan Greenspan was the chair of the Federal Reserve Board then in Washington, and he made a statement in early November that the economy fell off the cliff in October, and that's what our revenues showed. So we were in a position where we realized we had to take action quickly because it was already November, and we only had until the end of June to solve the issue, to make sure the budget was balanced by the end of the time. And so we immediately talked to the Democratic leadership in the legislature, talked to the Appropriations Committee about how we would go forward on a supplemental budget. But we also spent time as an executive branch looking at what are the alternatives that we have that we can do unilaterally to get the process started.
Yeah.
And we looked at curtailment of allotments of the appropriations the legislature had passed. We looked at furlough days for state employees.
Yeah.
We looked at raising fees on various services. We looked at postponing spending where we could, and all of those kind of things. And ultimately, we ended up doing all of those and even more in working with the legislature.
Fascinating. Similar question to you, Governor Baldacci. It seems that, as we've just noted, from day one, you were faced with a challenge and never really went away. It continued throughout your 8 years, most notably when the Great Recession grabbed all of us, including state budgets, and created a real challenge in that respect. You managed to do that without raising taxes. As a matter of fact, wasn't it in 2009, certainly your last budget, in which you signed a budget for something in the vicinity of $5.8 billion, but the significance of that was that it was $500 million less than the previous budget, and it was the first time since the 70s that your budget had actually been reduced. What did you do in the beginning, both for an action, but also set in motion that allowed you not have to raise taxes given those challenges? As a matter of fact, be able to reduce the budget in your final 2 years?
I was actually very lucky because being in business, we couldn't raise the menu prices, but we had to increase the availability and quality and supply of the product. And I approached state government the same way. There were a lot that we hadn't done. We hadn't become very efficient. There was too much duplication. There needed to be more consolidation, more efficiency, more good standard practices that people in Maine were going through. So we implemented a lot of those changes, and that was easier to do that because it hadn't been done for a while. And I think there's still a lot more that needs to be done. But Maine has too many levels of government, with county government, school administratives, local administration, state government, federal government, and we're paying for that bureaucracy. And Maine's tax burden is higher than the national average. Then it shouldn't be. It should be more commensurate with the pay that people get in Maine. And I think that's where I was fortunate that a lot of that stuff wasn't done yet.
You both have talked about curtailment orders. So often people will use the term executive order and so forth. But curtailment orders, that's something that's an instrument given to you by the Constitution that probably a lot of people aren't aware of its use, its validity when you're talking about making changes. Speak to that, both from the authority that it gives you, and how often, not specific numbers unless you know it, it became a practice.
Well, you're looking at me, so I assume you want me to start. And it's generally not
You
a
are
good.
the senior member
It's generally not a good idea.
of governors, not of the people here in attendance.
Yeah, well, it's also not a good idea to ask a lawyer to give a legal answer. It's going to be more than you want to know about the question, I'm sure. But it is an important concept. Now, there's a saying that the governors propose and legislatures dispose. And translated, that sort of means that it's only the legislature that can raise or spend taxpayers' dollars. But we have another provision in the Constitution that says that budget has to be balanced on an annual basis. So in their wisdom, actually, in 1975, the legislature passed a curtailment law. And what that did was give the governor, upon a determination by his or her commissioner of finance, that the projected revenues were going to be insufficient to meet the legislatively authorized spending in that year. And if that were the case, the governor could curtail allotments to the various functions of state government equitably to the extent necessary to keep the budget in balance by the end of the year. And that was a delegation of the ability to spend that had been given to the governor in limited circumstances for limited purposes, in case the legislature wasn't able to make those changes themselves to ensure that the constitutional requirement for a balanced budget would be met. And frankly, that law had never been used until 1991, when we used it. And what it does is it allows for the governor to take actions sooner rather than have to wait for the legislature to finally reach a conclusion. But the legislature always has the ability to override anything that a governor has done and to pass whatever law they want. But because the legislature's part-time, because they might not be able to reach agreement, because they may not be in session if there is an and you need to take action, they have a limited way that a governor can make sure that action is taken fairly that gets to the budget. The governor can't all of a sudden rewrite the budget. No. They have to do things equitably across the board, mostly in areas that don't affect the social safety net, those kind of things that determine equity.
You should tell Janet you'd make an excellent legal counsel.
She's a darn good lawyer herself. She doesn't need any legal advice from me.
So was it an instrument, I choose to use that word, was it something that you used during this time of challenge for you? Do you use it often?
No, I used it twice. I used it in January of 1991 as we were working with the legislature on a supplemental budget because we needed to get started. We only had 6 months. And so I used it in January for $40 million, cutting equitably for the spending for the rest of the year, in addition to a number of other things that we did while we were working with the legislature on the supplemental budget. And then the recession that I mentioned in the Northeast didn't end as soon as people had hoped, and we had to use it again in 1990, at the end of 1991 in November, for the 1992 budget, for another $105 million on that budget to make sure that it stayed in balance. But at the same time, we introduced a supplemental budget as well.
I think what Governor McKernan is also reinforcing is communications with the legislature, because you can't do these things unilaterally. You can do them, but you need to communicate, keep them abreast of the developments, and keep them close by, because I think it's important that you're following legislative intent. And I think that's what the governor's encouraging, is the communication between different levels of government and different branches.
So did you have the occasion to use it?
Oh yeah, we used it a couple of times.
Yeah. So it kind of helps me understand when curtailment orders are used and when supplemental budget adjustments are made. One is a factor of time and urgency, and the other gives you more time to really, you have that luxury. In all instances, there's a requirement to get it done because it has to be balanced, the budget, that is, as you said. Let me ask you this. It inspires yet another.
You may need to do the curtailment first, and then the supplemental budget would be something you'd want to enshrine in law or statute.
Okay.
Yeah, basically,
they kind of go together.
It takes a while for the legislative process to work its will.
Yeah.
And sometimes, as John said, you get to a point where you need to start taking action now. The legislature can always reverse it later, and reinstate money and move money around as is their responsibility. Yeah. But somebody needs to get started on the big picture until they can act.
Yeah.
And that's the intent of the law.
So let me continue along that path. So you issue the curtailment order, you set forth what you're going to do, you then give it to the legislature, which they have the option of putting their own fingerprints on that. They can make those changes. How often, because you're doing it under extreme conditions, it's not something that gives you a luxury of time, and you're making some, because of the challenge of the budget, you're acting immediately. They're probably unpopular choices, because when the financial circumstances that you both faced were not part of your plan, they can come anytime based upon national influence or circumstances. How many times did the legislature actually make modifications? Because many of the decisions you probably put in that curtailment order may have been unpopular and not something you wanted to do, because the budget may have already been passed, they were already planned, and then you cut it. How often did the legislature actually modify what you said or let you take the hit for what you proposed?
We had the issue with school administrative consolidation, and it was a way to invest in the classroom and the child's educational outcomes, and to bypass the school administrative bureaucracy,
Right.
and ended up taking it to a referendum vote.
Yep, I remember
which
it well.
the public voted to support that, almost 60-40. But those are, the legislature modifies that because it's not popular at the moment.
Yeah.
A lot of Medicaid cuts that we put forward, were very difficult to swallow. We had hearings at the Civic Center,
Oh.
and it wasn't very pleasant.
Yeah.
But we just didn't have the money. We needed to stretch the dollars. We needed to invest in health care, but do it smartly. And we needed to make sure that we had educational outcomes, because it's about cutting and balancing, but it's also about investing and growing.
And the other aspect that is important, you mentioned how often does the legislature get involved? Well, I can assure you the legislature reviews everything.
Right.
And but as governor, you are trying to make these cuts in as equitable a manner as possible. So when you make the cuts, you're sort of picking the least bad of the bad alternatives. So when the legislature looks at it, they may not like what you did, but when they start looking at what else they would have to do if they wanted to try something else, generally the vast majority of what is curtailed, I found, ends up in being left, and the supplemental budget might address a few other things. But we have in the executive branch of government a lot of very good people who spend a lot of time on these topics. So they've, as you know that from having been a commissioner, that they're giving the best answers probably that anybody's really going to come up with if you have to actually take the action.
Well, it's very clear to me that in the times and the challenges of your terms in office, as it regards the budget, it really is a call for strong leadership with you, which you both exhibited, and I give you great credit for that. But you weren't, as both of you have indicated, you weren't alone in the process. You had a legislature. Tell me about the legislature at that time. I can recall in both instances, but I'm going to let you answer that. What was the Republican, Democrat? What was the makeup of the legislature at the time? What were the bodies? Were they Democrat, Republican, the same, different? What was it? I'm going to let you go first, Governor.
Well, I think I was a part of that legislature with Governor McKernan. Governor McKernan was there.
We had one great Democratic senator when I was governor. He's sitting across from me.
Hopefully you have an opportunity to talk about the workers' comp law.
I'm going to get to that, trust me.
Okay. But no, I think that I had a Democratic legislature, and I think that it was difficult because they couldn't understand, as a Democratic governor, why we weren't doing certain things and being much more expansive. But the economy just couldn't afford it, and we weren't in the position with the recession and mill closings. So it was a very difficult and challenging time.
So the perception from the public may be that, oh well, they're all of one party, then the governor's doing whatever bidding that he wants. But that was clearly not the case.
No, there's only one cash register, and that's in the governor's office, and he has to balance it, and by the Constitution it needs to be balanced. Yeah. And you have bond rating agencies that look over your shoulder. I mean, you have a lot of second and third views at your budget and your finances, so you have to make sure it's real. It's not a phony budget.
So it doesn't always make it easier when you have the same party, yet continues to be a challenge, but of a different sort. Governor McKernan, I know yours wasn't all of the same party.
I take having to deal with my own party any day.
Okay.
that's sort of intramural stuff compared to, I was the first Republican governor in 20 years when I was elected in 1986 and had a Democratic legislature for my whole 8 years for both terms. And actually the first term went fairly well. We ended it amicably and generally got everything done that needed to get done. But the reason is because the economy was growing and revenues were increasing.
Yeah.
And so you didn't have to choose as starkly between the priorities of the different parties. Most people could get enough to feel comfortable that things were working. Then we got to the recession of 90 and 91. And that's when the differences between the two parties really comes out. Different priorities and how you're going to address setting those priorities when it means cutting basically everything, but some things a lot more than others, and how do you reach an agreement on that. And John was in the Senate at the time, and so he remembers these days. The budget was so difficult. You mentioned almost $1 billion in a $3 billion budget that we had to find a way to close that gap. And it became clear to me and even to a number of the other Republicans that if we were going to preserve the social safety net with all these cuts, we couldn't do it with the revenues that were going to come in during the trough of this recession, and we had to raise taxes. But I believed that there's a solution for each time that you're in, but you don't want to do things that are going to hurt you later to try to solve the short-term problem. So I required, if we were going to raise taxes, that all of them have automatic sunsets to expire once we were through the trough, because I didn't want to burden the state with, as John said, being the highest tax state in the country. When the economy was improving and we needed to have a good business climate to create jobs for people in our state. And so in addition to having sunsets on all these tax increases, I also said, and we need to relieve the burden on the cost of maintaining a workforce and hiring new people in our workers' compensation insurance costs, and get that from being the highest cost in the country down to the average of what other states have for costs of workers' comp. And we finally got an agreement with Democratic leadership on how to begin that process. And this is a day that I'll always remember, and a time that I'll always remember. When at 11:45 on the last day, p.m., 15 minutes before the end of the fiscal year, on June 30th, the Democratic leadership came to my office and said, we can't sell the workers' comp part of this to the Democratic caucus in the Senate. So I guess we're going to have to just pass the budget without the workers' comp changes. And I said, well, you better hustle back then. We got 15 minutes for you to figure out how you're going to find some more cuts, because I'm not signing a budget with any taxes in it if we don't have the workers' comp in it. And so we ended up with a 17-day shutdown over that issue and finally got it resolved.
To be able to come up with that is going a long ways, and we needed to change our workers' comp system because it was encouraging people not to work rather than to work. And it was just, not that there's anything wrong with lawyers, but there was just a lot of lawyers involved in the process, and I think that cost an expense that was tremendous. So
and actually that reinforces kind of a question that always goes with budget. Spending priorities, dealing with priorities plus a level of spending usually takes the entire first year session. But in the midst of all of that, there's always an issue that emerges that complicates the budget deliberations. And you just nailed it when you said workers' comp, because I remember that vividly. It was a tough time in the legislature. There was a lot of tension, a lot of anger. And it was a shutdown, but it eventually came together again because the commitment that was there to be sure that if we're going to do this in the budget, then I've got to have something in terms of lowering the cost. Governor Baldacci, was there, in your 8 years in the budget deliberations, something that might have been similar that created a conflict during these budget deliberations or added to the challenge of budget?
No, I got everything I wanted. It was just a perfect session.
Yes.
It was just lovely. When you don't have money to spend, you're making cuts, and I think that the hard thing was to always recognize that I was committed to not raising taxes. And as much as they tried to do tax reform or expand the sales tax base, you know, we kind of shut those arguments down, but that was the only difficulty, you know. But I think being able to, as governor, being able to tell your best friend that you can't do what they want you to do,
Yeah.
I think that shows the sign of a person who has the leadership capabilities to be governor.
Absolutely. Score that point for sure.
Absolutely.
Was there a turning point? How did you get beyond the impasse? Was there a moment, a time, a turning point that helped define that for each of you? Knowing that the budget challenges that you faced were enormous, not the normal.
Well, the turning point for us, obviously, was after 16 days of having a shutdown and having fewer and fewer services being able to be provided. Although, again, through the governor's executive powers, your ability to reinstate services grows over time, because the longer you're shut down, the greater the need is, and more services that can be added. But it's not the way to run a government, and eventually we were able to convince the legislature, thanks to people like Governor Baldacci when he was in the state senate, convincing his colleagues that we need to find some way to address workers' comp, and that was what the final solution was, to begin a process that was going to move our costs of workers' comp into more reasonable territory as part of that budget. And then by the end of 1992, we had a full change in the workers' comp laws that really made a huge difference in the business climate in our state that is still in place today.
You know, to establish what you did and we collectively did in the legislature, I've always remarked to people, it's one of the few times I think that we've actually seen things that turned out so well. And to have Mimic, now the Maine insurance company that was established when we first did this,
Exactly.
as a benchmark on what was going on in the industry, actually writing and sending checks back to businesses, I would never in my wildest dreams thought that would ever be possible from where we were, because
Exactly.
you know, when Liberty Mutual left the state, you know, it was a very low point for businesses, and they were paying outrageous amounts of premiums.
That's exactly right. I mean, businesses that they did business in Maine and did business in other states would come to me, and I'm sure you heard this when you were in the legislature, and say, your workers' compensation insurance costs are so bad that Maine isn't just the highest state that we do business in. We pay more in Maine than we do in all the other states combined that we do business in. And so it's just going to be.
How difficult was that for businesses to do business in Maine? I mean, just
Exactly.
And so it needed to be addressed, and it was done in a balanced way. And I think the proof is in the pudding today. It's not an issue, and we're in the middle of the pack, and they're doing business around the country. This Mimic that was established with John Leonard and now the new
Mike Bork.
Mike
Yeah.
Bork.
Yeah.
You know, they're giving checks back to businesses. So.
Yeah. Oh, it's a wonderful story. Let me turn that same question to you, Governor Baldacci. Yours is a little more difficult for me to frame it in a specific example, but from day one you faced challenges. You had the same party in both houses. You had needs that exceeded the money that was available, which is not unusual, but in this case exaggerated because of the financial challenges of 2008 and other situations, other circumstances during that time. Yet you reduced the budget the last year by $500 million, the first time since the 70s. You didn't raise taxes. How did that happen? I mean, it may not have been, the term may not be a turning point, but that didn't just happen without leadership, without a special formula. What was that special formula?
I had a wonderful group of people, as Governor McKernan talked about, his finance commissioner and his budget people. And you have a lot of really talented people. And I was with Becky Wyke and Ryan Lowe, and I had a group of people, Jane Lincoln. I mean, these people were very capable and very much the top of the heap as far as I was concerned. And so I had a really good team. A lot of things were not done before. I didn't feel that state government used Yankee ingenuity. I'd watch people in the business world that would use duct tape. They'd Band-Aid things to get by. They'd work extra hours. You know, they'd figure out ways to not raise the menu prices, but to make it more cost-effective in the kitchen. And I said, we need to implement some of those practices within state government. You know, at night, when you're at the Blaine House and you see all the lights on in the state office building, I would go over and shut them off, because the electric bill was like $5,000 or $7,000 a month. You know, but I just think that there are things that it hasn't done, regular practices. So, and I had really good people.
Yeah, during those times, when John was governor, Maine was very fortunate to have somebody with his philosophy and his common sense at the helm with a legislature of his own party, because I'm not sure a governor of another party could have done what he did. And a lot of the governors in his party wouldn't have been able to stand up to the pressure that he was facing from the legislature to do more. And that really made a difference in terms of getting Maine through that 2008-2009 real difficult period that states all over the country were going through because of the Great Recession.
Well, it's often said that you have people in leadership that are there because they are the right people at the right time. And I would argue that both of you were the right people at the right time. Let me kind of bring it to a close with perhaps one final question, other than the open question. Is there something, experience, or something that you feel needs to be shared that we haven't talked about? But I'll leave that for a moment. What I'd like to ask of each you now have Governor Mills, who has experienced a challenge that she didn't expect other as well, a challenge that is historic in terms of its impact. She has a supplemental budget she has to deal with. She has a biennial budget that she has to deal with. Both are experiencing shortfalls. She also has a legislature of the same party. What advice would you give, and she has a legislature, as I said, to deal with, what advice would you give to legislators who will be watching this in terms of your advice, your experience that would help them or that they should keep in mind as they struggle with this challenge that I've just described?
I think that it's important for everybody in Augusta to understand this is not going to be an easy next 6 months for 2021. But they will get through it. And they'll especially get through it if they just keep in mind that everybody is there to try to do what they think is best for the state. The governor will show great leadership, as a governor should in these times. And the legislature will represent the people of the state that come from their districts in trying to figure out how to strike the right balance in the suggestions that the governor makes. And I think that anytime you're in those situations, you just have to be sure that you understand that everybody's trying to do what they think is right. Yeah. And then the one piece of advice that I would give them is sort of the one that I've sort of reflected on since I was in office, is that when you're not in normal times, the normal solutions probably won't work. So you need to come up with other solutions that will be right for that particular time. But you have to make sure when you do it that you don't set in motion to cure the short-term problem policies that are going to undermine your ability to flourish when you get through that. And that's why we put sunsets on all of our taxes. That's why we took advantage of the opportunity to get workers' comp where it should be, so we could get businesses to hire more people and keep more people employed. And I think the same thing is going to be true as they go through these processes. There are going to be a lot of dislocations, and they're going to address them, and they're going to do the best they can do in the short term to deal with the pandemic. But they need to make sure they do it in a way so that when we get through this, and we will get through it, I mean, we'll be back to close to normal in a year or whatever the time period is going to be. And we need to make sure we have in place the policies to get us to there, and we have policies that will allow us to flourish when good times come back.
I agree with Jack 100%. I think that's the way you need to look short term, but you need to also be aware of what it does long term. No question about that.
And I'm sure John actually did that in 2008, 2009, which is why he didn't want to raise taxes, because he knew eventually we were going to come out of it, and you don't want Maine to be dragging when everyone else is in a position to prosper.
Exactly.
Well, you guys have been wonderful. Is there something that we haven't touched upon that needs to be spoken to or shared with our listeners, our viewers?
Well, I think the only thing that I would add to what I said a minute ago is just that in difficult times, people need to come together. And this country is so polarized, especially on a partisan basis, that we need to realize that the citizens of our state are expecting their elected leaders to realize that they're suffering in a way that is not their fault. And the government needs to step in and make sure that people don't slip through the cracks to the extent that they can, and to do it in a way that is going to also position Maine, now that the vaccines are out, to be ready for the resurgence that's going to take place in better times when we finish.
I think the only thing I would comment is I think they need to treat each other, whether they're Republican or Democrat or independent, with some respect and friendship, because you're going to remember the person more than you are the laws you pass or work on. And I think those relationships will help during difficult times when coming together, to pass a budget, or during a crisis to work together to cross the aisle. They seem to want to make the other person the enemy, and we got to listen to each other more, and we got to understand as long-term relationships in the legislature. It's like a family. And I remember Barbara Gill, who was state senator, Republican from Cumberland. She was a large woman in a lot of different ways, but she always say, "It's not over till the fat lady sings." And she would get up and break into chorus at the end of the legislative session, or they play the piano. Or the friendships you have. Those are things that we got to get back to. In that way we'll treat each other with a little bit more humaneness. But, I think all of this stuff going on in Washington, and some in Maine, it doesn't bring out the best in our features. And I think when Senator Snowe was in the Congress, and Senator Mitchell and Senator Cohen, I think that those days where they would work together, and Senator Collins tries to work on the other side of the aisle, they're very rare that it happens. And I just think that in our state we produce leaders on a national level because of the people on the local level.
Well, I thank you both. I want to close really with the following thoughts. What our viewers have seen today or been witness to are two very strong leaders who have represented the state exceedingly well. On display, you really have heard of and seen examples of strong leadership. It reinforces, in my opinion, the strength and the leadership requirement in times like this. The case can be made on any time, but clearly in the tough times when tough decisions need to be made, the role of the governor in that process is indisputable. And as I said earlier, it always seems that you get the right people for the right time. And Governor McKernan and Governor Baldacci proved then, and I repeat today, they were the right people for the right time, and there's a lesson to be learned today, tomorrow, whenever, by their very example. I also want to close on a personal note, is that I had the honor of working as a cabinet member at Transportation, as Governor McKernan mentioned, during his 8 years as governor. And we've heard about the challenges financially that he faced during that time. He also had a personal tragedy almost immediately after being reelected in the second term, in which those financial challenges emerged. No parent would want to deal with what he did. But let me tell you firsthand, he was an inspiration in so many ways, from not only what he did, but the way he did it. I cannot express enough my gratitude for the opportunity to serve in his cabinet, because I saw how he agonized over the budget issues, how he worked hard to maintain the services. I can say the same thing about Governor Baldacci. While I was not in his cabinet, our friendship was impeccable. He was always available to us. He always had that sense of humor that you saw today at some of the toughest times and some of the most major decisions that needed to be made. He would always consult, he would always include, he always did exactly what his closing comment said, that we are together in this, and together we can accomplish most anything we put our minds to. I am extremely proud to have known both of these leaders, and indeed they are leaders. We could not have done better for the times and the conditions, the challenges we faced. I want to thank both of you for that and for so much more. And thank you for the opportunity to present them and their experiences to all of you today. I know you can learn from them. Thank you.